this is Sean Law from Sydney Lorcana, here to talk about the deck that I used to win the store championship for Whispers in the Well at Decked Out. I was piloting a green-purple burn deck, and yeah, you may have seen this deck before, but I've made some additional modifications and tweaks which I think vastly improves the deck. So the first thing you'll notice with this deck is there isn't as many 1-drops as your standard green purple burn deck, and that other than Curse Merfolk and Diablo, none of my 1-drops have 1 willpower. This was deliberately done as, when I started I had Fred, Pegasus, but I found that those cards are vulnerable to Malicious, Mean, and Scary, and Fred also, once your opponent realizes what you're doing, they often don't actually challenge the Fred and can potentially race him and just ignore him. So, after some testing, I caught almost all the 1-power 1-drops, mainly just keeping Diablo because when it's banished I can draw a card, and Curse Merfolk for its high roll potential, and also because it's a 2 lore quester. It's actually the only 2 lore quester in the deck without additional costing. And the other reason for cutting the 1 willpower creatures is that it makes this deck a lot stronger against Malicious, Mean, and Scary, or MMS, because most of my stuff will survive, which then forces my opponent to try to actually resolve the Philip Shift combo or Sing Under the Sea, which can sometimes at times be too slow. And another thing you'll notice about my 1-drops is that most of them have either above average stats, particularly in the willpower, as seen in Palace Guard, which has the best stats of a 1-drop, but also in the Little John, because I just wanted another Palace Guard like toughness. And I've also got Flynn Rider, as he's a very versatile character. He can be a multi-quester if you need it, but he's also a good trade piece, as he can take out opposing Calhouns, and when combined with Webby Vanderquack, who gives +1 power, can take out daisies and other 4 willpower creatures. And the Webby is there because sometimes you just need that extra power to, particularly say on a Palace Guard who can take out a Captain Hook or a Rafiki and survive, or sometimes it's also used to set up a go-go play later on in the game. And the last 1-drop in the deck is Finnick, and I'm running him as a 3 of because you don't always want to see him in the early game, but in the late game he can be quite powerful. And if you're on the play and have a strong board, he can be also a huge tempo swing, particularly against Cinderella and Genie, because you can pay an additional 2 and then bounce an opponent's creature with power 2 or less, which can often time walk your opponent because they then have to they're then stuck with an uninkable in their hand that they either have to play or wait till a later turn to redeploy. And now with the other, you'll notice also with this deck that another card that is in most of the burn decks is Show Me More. When I first encountered this deck, Show Me More and Amethyst Chromacon were the main card draw engines. However, I quickly realized that Show Me More was often losing me more games than I was winning. And that's because this deck is essentially a battle of resources. As I said earlier, Curse Merfolk is the only card that quests for more than one, other than Flynn Rider, but that's a 3 ink investment, wanting to play at 2 ink to boost. And so how the deck sort of functions is that I try to get as big a lore lead as possible, and then I try to chain cards that gain lore and draw more cards, so that I can then close out the game before my opponent can establish a board that can outquest mine. And Show Me More was sometimes in these resource battles where I'm trying to bleed my opponent out of cards. Show Me More sometimes, whilst giving me the card I need to win the game, more often than not gave my opponent more resources which they could either commit to the inkwell or to the board, which increase their ability to either play bigger, more impactful cards, or go wide and potentially quest out sooner than I'd like. Which is why I decided to go with the Junior Woodchuck's Guidebook, as it's a very flexible card, particularly if your opponent isn't running any or much item hate. The fact that you can just play it for 2 and pay the 1 on a later turn to draw the cards is very useful, and particularly against matchups where the number of cards in your hand can be important, such as when you're playing against a shifted Clarabelle, or if you're playing against the purple decks with Demona. You generally want to keep your hands as low as possible, so that the Clarabelle player doesn't have the ability to draw cards unless they're singing songs. But at that point, they're not questing the board. Or if your opponent has to play a Demona to deal with your board, you're drawing 3 cards, and then you can pop the Junior Woodchucks, draw another 2, and then just vomit out your hand. So, and the other thing with Junior Woodchuck Guidebook is that it's not symmetrical. So one of the things you need to work out with the deck is which draw engine are you prioritizing. because they do different things. Because Amethyst Chromacon will generally draw you more cards, but if you play it at the wrong time, or sometimes you don't want to actually activate it and give your opponent the extra card, I tend to find that Amethyst Chromacon is better when you're on the play trying to close out a game, because you're just drawing, over 2 or 3 turns, you've drawn more cards than the Junior Woodchuck's Guide, and you've spent less ink to do it. But if I'm on the draw and I'm against a deck that I know has a lot of lower drops, even though Junior Woodchucks only draws you 2 cards, sometimes I'd rather draw the 2 cards than potentially give my opponent 3 or 4 cards and let them go wide. So, since I cut Show Me More, I found that I then had some uninkable space in the deck, and so that's why I've put in This Is My Family, as it's also a pretty versatile card. It's a song that can be sung by your 2-drops, if need be, but also because it only costs 2 ink, and it gains you a lore and draws you a card, it can sometimes just be hard cast in the late game as just a pay 2 ink, gain a lore, and draw a card, which could potentially allow you to see the card that you need. So, one thing you'll notice with this deck is that other than Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom and Enigmatic Inkcaster, almost every other non-character card replaces itself, and that's a key to this deck because I want to be drawing more cards than my opponent, because I can better utilize them as my curve is generally a lot lower. Some other cards that I've seen people consider or run in the green-purple burn deck are Family Fishing Rod. However, when I tested this card, I found that because it enters play exerted, and then you need to then pay an additional 1 to banish it to return an exerted character of mine to my hand to gain 2 lore, I found that effect was a bit slow, because you can't activate it the turn that it comes in, and so you're banking on your characters not being answered before you can actually use that item, which often in the later game my characters are really just there to help facilitate Enigmatic Inkcaster, because my opponent has so many ways of dealing with characters, between like Hades, Cheshire Cat, Songs. And another card I've seen people use in this deck is Scrooge McDuck Shush Agent. So it's a 2-mana uninkable 0/2 that when you play it, you draw a card and then choose and discard a card. And it quests for 2, and when it's challenged, you can return it back to your hand. And the thing with this card is that whilst it is strong playing it on 2, and I tried running first 4 of it and then kept cutting back because it usually in the later game, I'm playing the hands that the cards that I'm keeping in my hand. I don't really want to discard, and because his ability is mandatory, the draw and then discard, I was often finding that there are periods where they either get lumped back in your hand or my hand is pretty gassed, and I'm then drawing another gas card that I don't want to then discard any of them. So, and the matchups that he's quite helpful in is when you're playing blue, because he can often get potentially 2 quests off before they deal with it, because unless the blue players running a 1-drop like a Captain Hook or a Rafiki or a Basil or a Mulan, it can often sneak in a bit of extra lore. But I find against blue decks that on the whole this deck is usually pretty favored, and I'd rather deploy say 2 other characters, for example, say like a Flynn Rider and a Palace Guard, because I know that those cards will probably either quest twice, or the Flynn Rider could be used to potentially trade off into a Calhoun, or can grab a Captain Hawk and or a Rafiki, and then put pressure on your opponent to answer it. And the last card that I've seen people run is the 2-drop Maleficent Vengeful Sorceress, which is a 2-ink 2/2 that quests for 2. And yeah, the reason why I decided not to run that card was that whilst it is strong that it quests for 2, similar to Scrooge McDuck, I'd rather be playing a 1-drop on 1, 2 1-drops on 2, and then an Inkcaster and a 1-drop on 3. And then on turn 4, I'd like to play some card draw plus either another Inkcaster or Honey Marin, which I also found that, similar to a lot of the other cards, that this card is great when you get it early, but usually by the end of the game or the later stage of the game, it doesn't really do anything. And I wanted most of my cards to have that are 2-drops to all have some sort of additional, like, enter the battlefield ability, or like a kicker cost, like the Go-Go, which I find gets more value than the Maleficent. Another unique card with this list is that I'm running Go-Go Tamago. Now, she's gotten a lot worse than in previous sets due to the rise of Cheshire Cat in pretty much every purple deck, except really this one. But however, with Go-Go, because this deck can apply so much pressure, sometimes your opponent is forced to keep damage on characters because they don't have the ink to boost the Cheshire Cat and continue to develop their board. So Go-Go can give you potentially 1 to sometimes even 5 lore. However, she is less stronger in the purple matchups and is instead much better when you play against a deck that isn't purple. So like blue steel and blue green and chroma dogs. Honey Marin is pretty self-explanatory. It's essentially a cheaper rose most of the time because it gains you a lore if your opponent has something exerted, and because this deck is applying so much pressure because it just keeps vomiting out 1 drops and 2 drops, your opponent is generally forced to have characters turn sideways, particularly because a lot of my characters don't have really good stats. So my opponent's characters will often survive the challenge. The last 2-drop I'm running is 3 copies of Ursula Deceiver. She's good when you're playing against decks which have a lot of songs, but as a lot of decks are now relying more on non-song cards such as items and actions, or just big, better characters, she often doesn't hit as much as she used to. However, she can also potentially be good because you can see your opponent's hand, so it can help you work out, some cards to play around, or help you work out how much lore how much questing power your opponent can deploy. So you can then work out whether you need to trade or just ignore their board and just keep questing. Now the heart of the deck is the enigmatic Inkcaster. You generally want to see as many copies as possible in every game that you play, and the deck is built to capitalize on its lore gaining ability, where if you play 2 cards per turn, you can exert it and gain 1 lore, and if you can stick multiples of them in play, it can escalate pretty quickly. I've had games where my opponent has control of the board, they're killing or banishing every character I play, but because I've got 2 or 3 Inkcasters in play, I'm still gaining 2 or 3 lore, and often my characters also gain lore when they're being played, so there isn't much your opponent can do to stop you unless they're running specific item hate, which is at an all-time low at the moment because there isn't a real premier item deck. The last card I want to talk about is They Never Come Back, which is when I first encountered this card, it was used by Ruby Amethyst when I was playing Purple Steel, and it essentially banished my Cobra and my Iago, or my Iago and Palace Guard, and it also drew a card. So it's essentially similar to Hypnotic Strength, but it costs 1 ink more, but it has the potential to take out 2 illusions instead of 1. However, I feel that that's just the surface level of this card. The really strong part of this card is more the fact that it freezes 2 of your opponent's characters and doesn't allow them to ready for a turn. And in this deck, that can be potentially game changing, because when played at the right time, either my opponent can't challenge the way they want to, or more importantly, if they've got a 2 or a 3 quester in play, if I hit like two questers, or a 2 quester and a 3 quester, I can often buy myself sometimes even 1 or 2 extra turns, which could be all I need to close out the game. And yeah, so that's the deck. It plays a little different than your standard green purple, because this deck has so much card draw. I'm often getting up to 6, sometimes even 7 ink, even when not playing against the blue decks that, Hades or Into the Unknown into your Inkwell. But that, because some of my cards have additional abilities, sometimes I need 6 ink to fully utilize the cards in hand and still play 2 spells per turn. Now, so that's the deck. The strengths of this deck is that it can catch people off guard. It capitalizes on people's mistakes and can punish them greatly. And it also has inevitability, because once I get to a certain lore amount, say like 12 to 14 lore, I have so many cards that can either gain me lore, that even if I have no characters on board, or even if you're taking out my characters every turn, I'm still gaining between 2 to 4 lore a turn. Now, the weaknesses of the deck, it has some really bad matchups that are almost unwinnable, and it's also quite vulnerable to item hate. And it's also weak to certain aggro hate cards like Calhoun. However, this deck is also generally pretty good against blue decks, and often, whether you're on the play or the draw, you can generally close out the games before they stabilize, unless they either draw their particular hate pieces or they curve out perfectly. So now I'll talk about the matchups I had on the day. So we had enough people to play 4 rounds with a top 4 playoff, and it was a pretty stacked field. A lot of people there placed well at Melbourne, and some had even traveled overseas to Asian DLCs to also participate. So in round 1, I was paired against Jay, a Blurple expert who has top 32 2 DLCs, Melbourne and Singapore. He was not aware that I was running the deck, so I had a bit of an element of surprise. And in terms of the games, one was a bit close, but the other was very one-sided, because I got 3 Inkcasters in play, so every turn I was gaining 3 lore minimum, without accounting for either playing Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, or honey marins or roses to gain further lore. In round 2, I paired against Franz, who was playing Blue Steel. He's another strong player who made Day 2 in the Melbourne DLC last year, and he top 32'd in the New Zealand DLC qualifier. We played 2 games, which were very one-sided games. One game, I got a huge lead, and he was unable to catch up. And in the next game, he drew all 4 T-Pos and his Captain Hooks, whilst I drew 3 Curse Merfolk. Round 3 was against Chris, another strong Sydney player who top 64 DLC Melbourne and was on Purple Steel. This was a very hard matchup for me, as he had both aggro hate with Calhoun and item hate with a couple of benches. I lost the first game very one-sidedly, as he had a Calhoun on 2, which dramatically slowed down my ability to quest, as I didn't want him to gain 2 lore return. The second game was a lot closer, but I miscalculated how much lore he could gain in 1 turn, and therefore misplayed by questing instead of taking out one of his characters, which ultimately cost me the game, as had I challenged one of his characters and taken them out, he would not have been able to win the game the next turn, and I had enough resources to win the game the following turn. So that was round 3. And then in round 4, I played one of Sydney's strongest players, Jordan, or also known as JV. He's top 16 at Melbourne DLC last year. He top 16 the New Zealand qualifier, and he also top 16 DLC Singapore, and he was on Blurple. So we played only 2 games, but they both came down to the wire. Game 1, I got to 19 lore before Jordan stabilized, and he had Lorcal next turn. And at that stage, I had no cards in hand and 1 ink caster in play with plenty of ink. And from my turn, I drew a white rose, so I was able to just go to 20. Game 2 was another nail biter. After stabilizing, Jordan was threatening to close the game out on his next turn, whilst I needed another 2 turns to burn him out. He had enough questing power to get to 24 lore the following turn, which presented a problem, as that required me to answer multiple characters. So I started the turn by playing They Never Came Back on one of his Exerted Hades and his Genie to cut back his ability to get 4 lore, but he still had enough to get to 20. However, I had 3 ink left, as the previous turn Jordan had helped me ramp by Hadesing my White Rose, which then gave me the 3 ink I needed to play Finnick and pay the extra 2 to use his bounce ability on a Rafiki, which I then bounced back to hand, which then only enabled him to quest to 19 instead of 24. And as I knew that Blurple generally doesn't run reach cards, I was confident that that had bought me enough time, which ended up being correct. With that win, I made the top 4. So in the top 4, I played against Robbie, another strong Sydney player. He's won the most store championships of anyone I've ever seen. I believe he won at least 4 or 5 set champs in just 1 season alone. He also top 64 DLC Singapore. He was on Purple Steel, but was on a more aggressive, with a bit of mid-range on it. and he was running two cards that were quite problematic for me, Calhoun and Pete. Thankfully for me, I was able to play around these cards, and as I was the higher seed, I went first in 2 out of the 3 games we played, which helped a lot. And with that win, I was in the finals. So the other top 4 decks were Chris on Purple Steel, who I played earlier and lost to, and Franz on Blue Steel, who I had beaten earlier. And Franz was able to secure victory, so it was Emerald Amethyst Burn versus Blue Steel in the final. And with me being the higher seed, I went first. So we only played 2 games, and the first game on the play, I was just too fast. I had 14 or 15 lore before Franz was able to establish much on his board. And in game 2, he missed ramped on 2, and I was again able to build too much of a lore lead before he was able to get any of his multi-questers out, which enabled me to then have the reach to burn him out. All in all, it was a fun experience, and since playing the deck, many people in Sydney have started to bring in more item hate cards. However, despite this, I've so far made at least top 8 in the other 2 store championships I brought this deck to. In terms of other cards to consider for the deck, there were a lot of cards I wanted to test to see if they'll either speed up the deck or give it more flexibility, but I've not quite yet settled on the specific ratios of the new cards, though I have since added a 3rd copy of We Never Came Back, because that card has been very helpful in slowing my opponent just enough for me to squeak ahead. So I'd like to give a shout out to the Sydney Lorcana community, and a special thanks to Jordan JV, who lent me the enigmatic Inkcasters so that I could play the deck. If you like this content, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.